So welcome everybody. My name is Catherine Harlow. I'm the director of the Institute of Classical Studies in London, and it's my very great pleasure to be able to host online Professor Baltussen's Dorothy Tarrant Lecture for 2023. The Dorothy Tarrant Fellowship was established by the Institute of Classical Studies around 7 years ago in 2016, following on from our longer established Webster and Trendle Fellowships, both of which are field restricted. And the Tarrant Fellowship was established precisely in order to enable us to invite distinguished international scholars in any field of classical studies to come and spend a period of research time at the Institute to connect with the UK classical subject community and, of course, to present their research to a national and international audience. And we count ourselves very lucky to have had Professor Baltussen as our Dorothy Tarrant Fellow last term, because, as many of you I'm sure already know, he meets those criteria eminently. Professor Baltussen is the W. Hughes Professor of Classics in the Department of Historical and Classical Studies at the University of Adelaide. His distinguished career spans continents, from his graduate training in the Netherlands at Utrecht University, postdoctoral positions and fellowships in the US at Harvard, and early career work at King's College London, before pursuing his career in Australia. He is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Academy of the Humanities. His particular expertise is in the intellectual history of the Greek and Roman world, from the classical period to late antiquity, the history of philosophy and of emotions. I first crossed paths with Professor Baltussen around 10 years ago at a workshop organised in Oxford by Christine Krauss and Chris Stray on classical commentaries, which issued in a 2016 volume by OUP, to which Professor Baltussen contributed a chapter on the philosophical commentary from Plato to Simplicius. And that event was a really exciting one. I think what it and the volume showed was the importance of taking a really long view on the history of scholarship to understanding classical scholarship itself and understanding the classics, because of course there are so many ways in which modern traditions of scholarship work off ancient ones, but also can, I think, obscure the character and the agendas of ancient writers. And that's something we can see in various spheres of scholarship, but it is something that has been important, I believe, to Professor Baltussen's work, both on philosophical commentaries and his more recent work on philosophical lives. While he was in the ICS, he was pursuing further work on Eunapius, his Loeb, new text and translation of Eunapius' Lives of the Sophists is coming out, I believe, in June 2023, published very, very imminently. And we're delighted that he's going to talk about Eunapius today. There's one more thing I want to say before I introduce or hand over to Professor Baltussen for his talk, which is that he has been an extremely patient Dorothy Tarrant Fellow, and I would like to thank him for that. Not only was his fellowship delayed on account of COVID, I believe you originally accepted the fellowship in 2019, which of course was a bad time to be accepting an invitation for an international fellowship. But we also had to delay your lecture on account of the higher education strikes that were taking place across UK universities last term. So I'd like to thank you doubly for being doubly patient in waiting to give this lecture, and thank you very much for being willing to give it today. So I will now hand over the floor to Professor Baltussen for his lecture, Homeric Authority in the Service of Pagan Polemic, Poetic Allusions in Eunapius's Lives of Philosophers and Sophists. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for your kind introduction, Professor Harlow, and also to Valerie James and for hosting me in January and February this year. I'm just delighted that we can finally get going and do this. I had several discussions with some of the other fellows, and one of them really imposed on me that this thing is jinxed. It's not going to happen, he thought, because there were so many obstacles. But An obstacle is just another challenge to get further along. I should also like to thank the predecessor in your role of the ICS director, Professor Greg Wolfe, who was involved in my original invitation to this fellowship, 2019 for 2020. And of course, that, as you said, COVID prevented me from coming to the UK then. Now, as is good Australian custom, I will open by saying that I'm speaking to you from the land of the Kaurna people, traditional owners of the Adelaide Plains, land which was never ceded, and that I pay my respects to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. Just going to start and share the screen now. So people can see this. And here we go. Now, before I start the formal lecture, I would like to make a few preliminary comments. I would like to say that it's not only a real honor to have been awarded this fellowship, but also an immense pleasure. It is a real honor to be connected to such a formidable scholar, Professor Dorothy Tarrant. Educated at Girton College, Cambridge, and completing her studies with a double first at the classical tripos and ancient philosophy, she was awarded her doctorate at the University of London 10 years on, because Cambridge did not yet award degrees to women at the time. And she rose to prominence at Bedford College, becoming the first female professor of Greek in Britain in 1936, publishing some 20 articles in the following years, primarily on Plato, and continuing to publish even after her retirement in 1950. She was also president of the Hellenic Society from 1953 to 1956, and as a Unitarian, she campaigned for women's education and against the consumption of alcohol. I had the opportunity to visit the archive at Royal Holloway, which holds some of her personal papers, all written in an elegant hand with topics ranging from Homer to Plato to Aristotle to Theophrastus, a topic I have worked on myself, and general talks on education, fables, and Romans in Britain. That she was not just an overly serious scholar and activist, but had a sound sense of humor, emerges from these papers and biographical details. In one general paper on Greece, she characterizes Socrates as the greatest talker, adding later between the lines, quote, "I suppose Dr. Johnson comes nearest to him in our history," end of quote. Also, her friends and colleagues are said to have confirmed a sense of fun and disarming humor. For example, in 1941, she gave a lecture at Cambridge during the evacuation of London, in which she held an audience spellbound, talking about what she claimed was a newly found manuscript on Socrates, until she revealed that the work suggested members of Plato's academy were mostly women, and the conceit was thereby discovered. I therefore compliment the ICS for paying tribute to such an important female scholar in classical studies with this fellowship. It is also a pleasure for me to speak today, because as it happens, the text I shall be discussing, Eunapius's Lives, in the original 1921 edition shown here of Loeb, is closely linked to Professor Tarrant's main research interests, Plato and his influence. The new edition will appear very soon, as was announced earlier. The connections actually do not stop there, for as we shall see, linked to this text, we find two other equally formidable women. The first is Professor Wilman Cave Wright, who first edited a translation into English Eunapius's work in 1921, so a little over a century ago. Her first name was actually Emily, but she suppressed it to avoid a prejudice against work published by women. Like Tarrant, she was educated at Girton College, Cambridge, but she next followed Professor Paul Shorey, the famous Plato scholar, to the United States to do a PhD on the 4th century Emperor Julian, also known as the Apostate. She became professor of Greek at Bryn Mawr College and had a brilliant career as a translator of Eunapius, all of Julian's work, and some complex medical texts from the early Renaissance. Her biographer, Mabel Lang, quotes an interesting note from one of her books, the De Morbis Typographorum, in which the editor comments, quote, "She maintained a staunchly English air throughout the life, coupled with a love of heavy jewelry. Even in her 80s, her students and colleagues likened her to Pallas Athena herself, walking the earth with a proud look and a clank of silver." Well, one glance at her photograph here on the right, and we can easily imagine what that may have looked like. Well, for those who are interested in finding out more about her, I recommend David Green's detailed account of her rise in the profession, from which I took the photo on the left, because it is an extremely interesting book on how the role of women in classical studies is coming to the fore in the first half of the 20th century. And last but not least, we find an extraordinary woman in the text to be discussed today by the name of Sosipatra, who in Eunapius's judgment has no equal in learning and special powers. Of course, we do not have an image of her, so I've chosen a standard representation of a woman, a female figure represented as an intellectual or philosopher. But since I will spend some more time on her later, I will refrain from saying more about her now. So there we have it. This lecture is connected to three striking women with a deep interest in Plato and Platonism, a fitting tribute to the importance of female scholars and thinkers in classical studies. And now it's time for me to start my formal lecture. If we were to visit Sardis, former capital of the Persian Empire, around the end of the 4th century CE, we would encounter an industrious author called Eunapius, putting pen to paper and producing several works that will prove essential for the study of the 200 years before his time. For some of you, he may well be the most important Greek historian of the 4th century you may never heard of. His life extended from the mid-4th century to the early 5th century, as you can see here on the slide. And the slide also indicates how some of the works, things that he reports on, and events and figures actually overlap with his own life. The two works that he's famous for are each have their distinct character. The one is an historical account of the events in the Roman Empire from the late 3rd century to the subsequent century. And the second work is complete, but contains many textual problems due to its transmission. Now, while Eunapius is still viewed mostly as a historian, I want to focus today on his biographical work and put some question marks around that. In this work, Lives of Philosophers and Sophists, in the following I will refer to it as VPS, Eunapius offers us biographical sketches of some 29 philosophers and orators from the 3rd and 4th centuries. And I have a few figures here that are very important to him: Porphyry, Plotinus, Iamblichus, and Julian. Generally regarded as a work that only makes a mediocre contribution, both in form and in style, its content and value have received a lot of attention in the past decade. So here you see some of the work that has been appearing in roughly the last 15 years. The question of its genre has also generated debate. Academics are not always sure where to place it, because they tend to regard Eunapius primarily as a historian. Scholars today still agree that biography is difficult to define. Somerset Maugham is supposed to have quipped, "There are 3 rules for writing biography, but unfortunately, no one knows what they are." Now, this quote has actually been used in a recent work, an edited volume, where people were discussing the difficulty of defining this particular type of biography genre. And one of the reasons often given is that there was no theorized idea about or concept about biography in antiquity, until very late, at least. So, although the work contains valuable historical information on late antique Platonism in the 3rd and 4th centuries, relaying details on individuals for whom we may have little information elsewhere, the work, I suggest, defies simple categorization. Asking what its focus or subject is turns out to produce several different answers. The genre question, along with the scholarly appraisal that the style of the work is mediocre, has, in my view, led to a one-sided and even misleading characterization of the work as a whole, and to undervaluing certain significant details. We will do well to take Eunapius's own aim under consideration, if only to assess what his aspiration was, irrespective of whether he achieved this. And I note that Eunapius does not have his own separate chapter, for instance, in a very recent collection of works on ancient biography. He is in this work combined with Philostratus, as he has been ever since the first edition of the Loeb in 1921. Philostratus wrote about sophists of the 2nd century. Now, this is an unfortunate move, I think, which perpetuates the early 20th century reading of the two and makes Eunapius simply a Philostratus epigon and skews the interpretation of his work in an unhelpful way. Eunapius does, however, have a chapter in the Historians of Late Antiquity, the one you see here on the right. Now, consider his aim given right at the start in VPS 1.2. Eunapius writes, "My aim of my narrative is not to write of the lesser actions of distinguished men, but their main achievements. Not indeed with complete certainty as to all matters, for it was impossible to collect all the evidence with accuracy." Now, those familiar with the biographical tradition may recognize that this kind of comment directs a biographer's choice on what to include and what to leave out. So the paradoxical situation we have for his two works is this. The fragmentarily extant historical chronicle, the historical work, has received its due place in the historical tradition, but the fully extant work of the lives has not received proper and independent attention in the biographical tradition, at least until very recently. Now, in his opening section here, just quoted, Eunapius builds a contrast comparing himself to the Athenian general Xenophon, who wrote several biographical works, perhaps the first in Greek literature. And Eunapius is keen to clarify how his work will be different, not both par erga and erga, lesser activities and main activities, but only those that were considered to be the main achievements. Such a choice calls to mind, for instance, Plutarch's Life of Alexander, in which among his opening remarks he suggests that the small things can reveal big traits of character. So Eunapius not only places himself implicitly in this long biographical tradition, referring to a classical author of the 4th century BCE and an imperial author of the 1st century CE, but he also wants to make his mark by boosting his own profile and claiming the high road in his chosen topic. It is, he says, about great men and great deeds. But as we will see, both features are meant to create a persuasive account in which he especially focuses on the moral excellence as well as the divine quality, as he sees it, of these particular men. Now, such a rhetorical opening already signals to the reader that Eunapius has an ambitious plan. He will go on to narrate the remarkable qualities and actions of his chosen personalities, perhaps implying that he may outdo well-known classics. The focus of this lecture is to question what role the references to Homer play in his aspiration to boost the profile of these subjects. This strand of his writing is one of the lesser studied aspects of the lives. But I think this traditionally literary device of intertextuality and allusion adds a significant component to his strategy of declaring many of the individuals not just morally superior, but also having a close link to the divine. Thus, my focus today is on just one aspect of a multi-layered argument in Eunapius of praising non-Christian philosophers and orators for their moral and religious preeminence, with a special emphasis on Iamblichus, his followers, and several other remarkable figures. It seems to me that as the pagan poet par excellence, Homer's importance for Hellenic culture can be read as infusing Eunapius's comments on such special characters with authority in contrast and contradistinction to the heroes of Christianity, namely the saints. Now, that there was no love lost between Eunapius and the Christians is clear from several statements in both his works, and famously, the 9th century patriarch Photius, who still had a copy of the historical chronicle, claims that he had a second edition purged of its anti-Christian comments. In the Lives, Eunapius also rails against the influx of monks into Egypt in anticipation of the destruction of the great Serapeion temple. This is what he says about them. Next, into the sacred places they imported monks, as they called them, who were men in appearance but swine in lifestyle, and openly did and allowed countless unspeakable acts. Yet this they considered piety, to show contempt for the divine. For in those days, every person wearing a black robe and willing to display unseemly behavior in public possessed the power of a tyrant. To such level of virtue had the human race advanced. It is clear that his description here is dripping with sarcasm and a kind of contempt for what they are doing. And this is, as it were, an implicit agenda that he wants to counter. He further criticizes the monks for taking over Hellenic sacred places a little later in the text. They settled these monks also at Canobus, and thus fettered the human race to the worship of slaves, and not even honest slaves, instead of intelligible gods. And for they collected the bones and skulls of criminals who had been put to death for numerous crimes, made them out to be gods, haunted their sepulchres, and thought that they were better than others, while polluting themselves at the graves. Witnesses, martyres, the dead men were called, and servants of sorts, and ambassadors to carry men's prayers. Clearly a hint at the intercession that was going on there. In other words, such remarks fit the ongoing intellectual rivalry between Christian and pagan authors from the 2nd century onwards, when we find in Christian authors such as Eunapius and Jerome very similar attacks and polemical comments. That by way of introductory remarks. Now let me turn to the matter of Homer in the VPS. Scholars working on Homer reception in antiquity tend to divide into roughly 2 camps. On the one hand, there are those who think Homer is so ingrained in Greek education that allusions to his work are habitual and to be expected, and they consider his presence a form of literary embellishment, which can serve a purpose or be just that, embellishment. On the other hand, there are those who believe that Homer's presence shows that ancient authors often adapt the Greek poet and defend it as a form of active transformation, which offers a new reception of the stories and characters in the epic tales. For instance, Fagles noted in his introduction to the Penguin translation of the Oresteia that Aeschylus referred to his work as slices from the great banquet of Homer, but his powers of assimilation were impressive. He deepened Homer with older, even darker legends, and lifted him to a later, more enlightened stage of culture. Similarly, Richard Hunter has commented in his 2018 book on the reception of Homer that, and I quote, Greek literature of the imperial period offers an intense creative engagement with Homer. Needless to say, I will take Eunapius' work as an example of that second type. I want to argue that a renewed examination of Homeric allusions in the VPS may not only alter the verdict on Eunapius' literary merits, but will also make us more aware of his underlying agenda. Now, as to the evidence for Homer's presence in Eunapius, I should begin by pointing out that the evidence is actually certainly richer than is often acknowledged. While some 18 instances of quotation partial of full lines are explicit and noted in recent commentaries, a considerable number of elusive and hidden references to Homer should be added, which brings the total up to at least roughly some 30 of them. The irregular and partially hidden presence may have caused scholars to overlook the possibility of a pattern or special purpose, with one exception. Unsurprisingly, Alan Cameron, who studied late historians in the antiquity in his last Pagans of Rome, also highlights Eunapius as a standout in the use of Homer, stating in both his Chronicle and the Lives. If we are looking for a large-scale 4th century pagan history, he says, with a taste for oracles and quotations from Homer, Eunapius is clearly the frontrunner. I believe that Homer's presence will gain in importance once fully collected, reviewed, and contextualized. But I will go one step further. I will argue that we can also infer the motive for the specific use of Homer if we consider the question of the purpose of their lives as a whole. I will challenge the position that this historian of the 4th century CE was merely sprinkling his biographical prose with Homeric allusions to show off his knowledge of the great pagan poet of old. And I will ask how we can explain the strategically placed references and allusions for several of the persons he discusses. From this vantage point, we will be able to appreciate how his use of Homer is a significant part of a polemical strategy against the Christians. To lead into the discussion, a few comments about the content and structure of the work will be helpful, since it might not be familiar to many of you. We already saw that Eunapius states his aim at the start. He then proceeds to discuss 29 individuals. And he divides them up into 3 groups. And he also has a clear preference for 4 individuals, here indicated with the arrows. The order of this account allows us to see that the structure is not a random list, but compiled by creating 3 groups and following a pattern that indicates that it is about teacher-student connections, which emphasize intellectual lineages to which Eunapius himself also belongs. His criteria for inclusion should therefore be our guide in reading his biographical sketches. Yet anyone who has read them will easily recognize that the sketches exhibit a rather irregular choice of topic. Apart from place of birth, teachers, and some anecdotes, and the approximate age of death, there are few standard biographical elements. However, what they do share amounts to a set of unexpected events which can appropriately be called miracles. As we will see later, Iamblichus levitated and conjured up boys from springs, Plotinus saved Porphyry's life, Sosipater appears to be omniscient and omnipresent, and Prohyresius, Eunapius' revered teacher, has such powers of total recall in oratory that an event proving this leads to divine worship by the audience. These, then, are the basic points that triggered my argument. They indicate a pattern in which many of these miracles can in fact be aligned with the Homeric references across the text in interesting and significant ways. Now, these Homeric features of the text can, I believe, be divided into 3 rough types. There are the passing references, there are the short phrases, and there are elusive echoes and quotations. As you can see, I'm not so naive as to think that all Homeric references and allusions would serve this special agenda. Some brief Homeric allusions can only be classified as probably literary embellishment. Striking examples of this category show the ease with which Eunapius can draw on Homer for suitable literary effect, and I'm giving you here a couple of examples now. In one case, a figure called Maximus, his voice is compared to that of a major god in Homer. There is a description of an awkward discomfort and an appearance, and this reminds one of the naked Odysseus in Book 6. Poetic is described as Homeric Hermes. I'll come back to him later, and so on and so on. So these are kind of quick passing comments in which we see that he is actually referring to Homer in a very literary way. Is kind of the intertextuality that adds to the text. Now, these examples are no doubt just stylistic flourishes on account of their brevity and casual nature, and nonetheless, they already contain hints on how the Homeric reference can enhance the stature of a person. The cases of Prohyresius, Eunapius' beloved Athenian teacher, where he's compared, for instance, to Homeric Hermes, means that he is being compared to a god, and to Odysseus, which means an archaic hero. Likewise, Maximus's voice is compared to, again, voices of gods in Homer. All the other examples contain specific and often explicit references to Homer. G and H are different in kind because they place Homer in opposition to the poet Polemic and the sculptor Phidias, showing us Eunapius in the role of a kind of literary or cultural critic who comments on Homer, not by way of the poet's words. This kind of stylistic use is further visible in two other moves in which Eunapius actually constructs full-blown long similes in Homeric style. And these are worthwhile in brief examination before we dive into the main part of the argument. These striking cases of Homeric simile are applied to figures Eunapius happens to admire, namely a sophist called Sopater and the famous orator Libanius. And even though these can be regarded as stylistic feature, Eunapius uses them to augment the importance of both figures. So in the case of Sopater, he's comparing him to Socrates. And like Socrates, Sopater was treacherously killed, this time in Constantinople, on a false accusation. At least that is how Eunapius wants us to believe things went. The case of Libanius, admittedly a less complimentary description on this point, presents his decision to learn rhetoric outside the classroom first by practicing hard instead of studying consistently with good teachers as guides. Now, all in all, the cases I've given you so far constitute roughly 1/3 of the short Homeric references, used primarily as stylistic enhancements, with two cases that had a stronger message, privileging Prohiresius as a heroic and godlike figure, and adopting the Homeric simile as a more emphatic form of presentation. So what about the remaining 2/3 of cases? I believe that among the remaining cases, a good number represent the strategically placed allusions and quotations that point to a strategy to enhance his anti-Christian polemic. In addition, I will suggest that the full set of allusions and references, to my knowledge hitherto not collected and evaluated, have a cumulative effect in demonstrating my line of interpretation. So you see here a full collection of what I consider to be all the references and allusions to Homer, and the ones with a little star in the left column, second half, are the ones that we have discussed so far. And I will go on to discuss some of the others now that are more significant in my view. So let me start this set of examples by highlighting one interesting passage which I believe has been overlooked by recent commentators on the text. It can stand as a suitable transition from the brief Homeric examples so far, in which divine qualities play a more prominent role. This case combines a hidden claim for divine status for Iamblichus on the basis of a Homeric allusion. At VPS 5:19-21, we find a curious description of one of Eunapius's greatly admired figures, Iamblichus, who performs an act which one could only describe as miraculous or perhaps even magic. When his students find out that he has special powers, it is a slave who tells them that he can levitate, they approach him and ask that he reveal his powers. Iamblichus is initially very hesitant, offering as a reason that it would be impious to show them. But when the students persist, he conjures up from two springs two young boys of remarkable beauty. While the whole life of Iamblichus is peppered with comments on how his deeds and character reveal his divine nature, the description of the two boys emerging from the springs, Eunapius calls them eros and ant-eros, contains some striking vocabulary which reminded me of a passage in the Odyssey. So here is the first passage in which we see that the boy was described as white-skinned and of medium height. His golden locks provided a glow to his back and chest. Next he summoned another Eros, like the first in all respects, except that his hair was darker and fell loose in the sun. Because of certain key terms underlined here in the translation and in bold in the Greek, I was reminded of a passage in Odyssey, Book 6, when Homer describes the transformation of Odysseus by Athena. He received, so to speak, a makeover when he meets Nausicaa on the islands of the Phaeacians. Here is that passage. Athena, daughter of Zeus, made him taller and sturdier for the onlooker, and caused the bushy locks to hang from his head, thick as the petals of a hyacinth in bloom. Just as a craftsman put a graceful finish to his work by overlaying silverware with gold, she endowed his head and shoulders with beauty, and he was radiant with grace and beauty. The girl gazed at him. Now, since my point here hinges on the vocabulary, I have added the Greek words in this particular case, which give us various echoes of the Homeric words in that passage, referring to golden hair, a flow across head and shoulders, the sheen, and so on. So putting them next to each other, we might see that there is this particular kind of reference through a choice of vocabulary in which an almost emblematic description of a beautiful person has here picked up on words in Homer's description of Odysseus after the makeover by Athena. The close resemblance in its essential elements to the Homeric passage is striking. The emphasis is on beauty and radiance, and it seems to have inspired Eunapius' description. If so, the additional resonances with artful handiwork also suggest that Iamblichus is godlike in a comparison with Athena, except that in his case, his action looks more like a creation out of nothing. Now, I realize that some of you in the audience may find the case not fully persuasive, but I would point out that I'm not even arguing for a direct borrowing. It is the first of many more cases I will examine shortly, which builds on the one I have already mentioned. So let's continue and see how the cumulative effect actually does its work. What this example concerning Iamblichus and several others help us to see is that Eunapius places Homeric echoes and allusions in those passages in which he is also keen to emphasize the pious attitude and what he calls divine nature of several personalities. Thus, he combines two significant themes, and does so more often, when he wants to uncover a close link between humans and gods. Iamblichus is clearly one of the most admired among the ones he describes, but he also has a special place in his heart for Plutarch, Porphyry, and Prohiresius. Eunapius wants us to regard them as very special individuals. And I think it cannot be a coincidence that only these four receive the superlative theotatos, which I've rendered in my translation as most divinely inspired in my forthcoming Loeb translation. It is almost as if Eunapius uses Homer to reinstate the archaic notion that the presence of gods was a fact of life and that extraordinary individuals were often compared to divine beings. And I'll come back to that a little later. Eunapius exploits this feature by inserting Homeric words, phrases, and similes in places where this divine association suits him in order to enhance the status of his protagonists. Now, of course, it will be good to illustrate my point further with additional instances in the text like this one. For instance, similar special powers of Plotinus are revealed in an early short passage when Porphyry, deeply influenced by Plotinus' teaching to reject the body, leaves for Sicily and tries to starve himself. Eunapius recasts Plotinus' subsequent actions to follow and rescue him in Homeric terms. Arriving in Sicily, Plotinus locates Porphyry, and the following description ensues. There he lay, groaning and starving himself, and he would take no nourishment and avoided the path of men, reference to Iliad. But great Plotinus kept no vain watch, again Iliad, on these things, and either followed in his footsteps, and so found him lying there. And then he found abundance of words that recalled to life his soul, as it was just about to speed forth from the body. Moreover, he gave strength to his body so that it might contain his soul. So Porphyry breathed again and arose. The two brief phrases from the Iliad are easily spotted due to their metrical form and would have been noticed by those well-versed in the Homeric works. It does not take much effort to see these passages as an implicit way to compare Plotinus to Apollo, where these phrases are applied, thus once more attributing divine status to him, much like the earlier example of Prohiresius. And surely Plotinus' act of reviving Porphyry makes a link to Apollo as the healing god highly appropriate. Plotinus, in fact, saves Porphyry and brings him back to life. Now, this fact of bringing someone back from the brink and other aspects of the story were, in fact, not long ago taken up by the French scholar Jeff Fagnon to argue quite persuasively that they offer plausible evidence for being a counter-narrative to some parts of the New Testament story regarding Jesus' raising from the dead. The special status of Porphyry is found a little later, once he has recovered Porphyry is compared to Hermes, an unmistakable, if perhaps inappropriately used, reference to Iliad 8:19. It occurs in the context of Porphyry's full recovery and his outshining of Plotinus in his pedagogical skills. And here is the passage. Plotinus, because of the celestial quality of his soul and the oblique and enigmatic character of his discourses, came across as overly serious and hard to listen to. But Porphyry, like a chain of Hermes let down to mortals on account of his wide-ranging erudition, expounded all subjects so that they were clear and easy to understand. The phrase expresses a notion widespread, that is the chain of Hermes, widespread among late Platonists and based on this Homer's passage that indicated the succession of philosophers, being like a golden chain forged by a god. A later case could be adduced, very similar to Plotinus saving Porphyry's life, in which Eunapius sets himself up with dramatic poise as being revived, and it almost looks like a reenactment of this particular scene. It doesn't seem to be a case where we have a Homeric reference or allusion, but it is interesting to see how Eunapius then, in applying it to himself, makes this particular passage of Plotinus and Porphyry like a template for the way that he describes his own rescue, as it were. Eunapius places himself at the center of the narrative here and describes how he's brought back from the brink by a physician. A certain Aeschylus, called out in the midst of those grieving over me because he was very ill, as became known to me later. He's very keen to make sure that he indicates that that is something that he could only have known afterwards. Allow me, Aeschylus is supposed to have said, to give medicine to the corpse. So Aeschylus talks about him as if he were already dead. Then he held my lips apart with certain instruments and poured in a drug. What it was he revealed afterwards, and the god many years later bore witness to it. At any rate, he poured it in, and the patient's stomach was at once purged. He saw daylight, returning back to the line of the living, as it were, and recognized his own people. And he ends by declaring it a case of being delivered from death. It is hardly a casual comment, and the parallels in the text to the cases of Plotinus and Porphyry, and in fact a later case as well related to Oribasius, Julian's physician, they show that the notion of restoring someone from fatal illness or the brink of death is one of the powers these special men possess. My third important figure in the lives which deserves our special attention in this context is the philosopher I mentioned at the start, who goes by the name of Sosipatra. Her story stands out not only because she is the only female philosopher in VBS, a surprise given how Eunapius initially only spoke of men, but also because he's regarded as superior to most men for her knowledge and wisdom. The story is one that both delights and worries a modern audience. The father of Sosipatra is persuaded by two strangers with knowledge of Eastern mysteries, it turns out to be the Chaldean oracles, to hand over his 5-year-old daughter for education and initiation, and to leave his property for 5 years while this takes place. So he leaves her behind, and when he returns after 5 years, he's suitably impressed to find a girl, presumably now about 10 years old, more mature and very beautiful. There's the notion of beauty again. She is now fully versed in literature, philosophy, and Eastern wisdom. The narrative of Eunapius actually makes much of the father's perspective, emphasizing how he experiences the whole episode. He hardly recognizes his daughter initially, nor she him, so much has she changed in appearance and demeanor. And she seems to be omniscient. He had traveled, it says, on a 4-wheeled carriage, and she related every event, not only what had been said, but his very perils and fears, as though she had been on the carriage. The father came to be so full of amazement that he did not merely show admiration, ethomazden, but was awestruck, kateplereto, and he was convinced that she was a divine being. Now, the girl recounts these things to have happened to him during their separation, and he is described as awestruck, and deciding that she now seemed to him to be a goddess. The vocabulary that I have highlighted here clearly has religious overtones. As a result, he implores the strangers to take her on for another period, so they can initiate her into even more sacred mysteries. Here too, the strangers, who have revealed their deeper knowledge of the Chaldean oracles, become gods in his eyes. To bring this point home, Eunapius now resorts to a move which pretends to know the father's mind and has him quote Homer to describe his feelings about his whole experience. And this is the passage. In his mind, katapsychen, he gave Homer the highest praise for having sung of such an occurrence as this, so portentous and divine. And the passage is Odyssey 17, 4856. And the gods in the likeness of strangers from far-flung places put on all manner of shapes and wander through the cities. He did indeed believe that he had encountered visitors in human form, but who were in fact gods. The use of an explicit quotation of several lines, whether imagined as the father's thoughts or as Eunapius' own addition, is an emphatic association between the Homeric authority on what gods are up to and the men who have trained his daughter, but also his daughter herself. So let me add a last example of this set of four to actually try and persuade you what's going on with the Homer references. My last significant example of this group of very special protagonists concerns his teacher, Prohiresius, who was characterized as an ascetic, a teacher of rhetoric, and a Christian, but also as a man of, again, unusual beauty, great stature, and physical resilience. Early on in the life, Eunapius offers his typical example of his descriptive style, again comparing a human to a god. For Prohiresius, his eloquence sufficed, much like Homeric Hermes, escorted Priam to the hut of Achilles, though it was amid his foes. And in this particular case, Prohiresius is indeed also amid his foes. Once again, one of Eunapius' heroes is compared to a god and given the honor of having immense persuasive powers, like those described in Iliad 24. This panegyric tone continues when Prohiresius displays his rhetorical skills in a later passage. He raises him the stakes and promises to show, Prohiresius that is, his exceptional, or should we say superhuman skill of total recall when composing an improvised speech. Shorthand scribes who have been called in prove him right, and the audience's response is one of adulation fit for a god. First, Eunapius admiringly writes, Prohiresius began his speech with a flood of eloquence, rounding every period with a cadenced phrase, and as the speech grew and the man soared to heights defying human description of belief, he passed on to the second part of the speech and completed the exposition of the theme. And then, turning to the scribes, he said, "Observe carefully whether I remember all the arguments that I used earlier." And without faltering, he began to declare the same speech for the second time. All who were present licked the sophist's breast, as though it belonged to a statue of some god. Some kissed his feet, others his hands, others declared him to be a god, others an exact replica of Hermes Logios, the god of eloquence. Prohiresius thus became a reincarnated Hermes, at least in the eyes of some. Now, these four cases give us enough reason to regard the use of Homer more complex than simple literary embellishment. As the simple diagram here shows, in some cases the references cluster together in a very significant way. As you can see here in Book 6 and Book 10, there are some real outliers in the way that Homeric clusters come up. And as it happens, this high concentration falls around Sosipatra and Prohiresius. But to bring home my argument and possibly persuade any remaining skeptics, let me end with one final example that exemplifies how Homeric allusion reinforces the divine nature of his heroes. In my title, I promised to talk about Eunapius' polemical use of Homer against Christians. While our cases so far exemplify a positive boost for his personalities, these final examples illustrate how Eunapius, so to speak, weaponizes Homer against Christians. Usefully, in his 1973 study of three orators from the Second Sophistic, the period roughly from the late 1st to the middle 3rd century CE, Tarrant argued persuasively that the orators of that period made elaborate use of Homeric tropes and phrases. They not only aimed to emulate Attic speech-making stylistically, but also its cultural frame of reference, thereby enriching their epidactic displays with echoes and allusions to the great literature of ancient Greece. As the chronicler of the so-called Third Sophistic, we might say, Eunapius can be said to continue this tradition 150 years later, but he does so in his own original way. Out of Tarrant's 5 types of Homeric allusion in the speeches, and they are authoritative, polemical, illustrative, comparative, and decorative, I will use an example from type 2, which on the basis of a thematic connection or association with the narrative, clearly intends to make a very specific point. While quoting a line from Homer, Eunapius does not offer a philosophical or allegorical interpretation of the text in the same way that the 6th century philosopher Theagenes had done, or Porphyry in his work Cave of the Nymphs. But just to illustrate his polemical use, here's an example in which he uses Homer to malign a much-hated figure, drawing a more damaging comparison between the bishop of Alexandria, Theophilus, and the leader of the giants, Eurymedon, by quoting the Odyssey. The temples at Canobus also suffered the same fate in the reign of Theodosius, when Theophilus presided over the abominable ones, like a kind of Eurymedon who ruled over the proud giants. Odyssey 7, 58-59. If it seems that this is a rather brief and elusive mention without further meaning, it is crucial to point out that the relevant passage in the Odyssey has a significant extra line, which would certainly have been known to a well-educated audience, which adds an intriguing dimension to the whole use of the Homeric passage. Let me show you what I mean. Great-hearted Eurymedon, who was long ago king over the giants who were proud and bad, he killed them, his own people, and then got killed himself. The comparison to Eurymedon now becomes highly suggestive. It not only labels Theophilus as an immoral ruler over evil creatures, but also implies that he could meet a sticky end, an implication which would not have escaped Eunapius' audience. Eunapius had just compared the conflict between Hellenes and Christians to the mythical battle of the giants, when the giants gained the upper hand. Such imaginative recasting of the conflict as a battle of cosmic forces shows how Eunapius not only wants to persuade us of the all-encompassing nature of the problem, but also shows how Homeric language and imagery can enhance such a depiction and facilitate passing moral judgment on his enemies. In the work as a whole, this is probably the first clear example in which he seems to suggest that Homer, the Hellenic poet par excellence, can be weaponized against the Christians. So these last 4 cases concerning Iamblichus, Porphyry, Sosipatra, and Poirisius then are, as it were, the cherry on the cake of the fuller body of evidence for this very particular strand of poetic allusions from Homer in Eunapius' lives. And I will now try to draw some conclusions. I have argued that Eunapius' life offers a special case of Hellenic fervor to resist the ever-growing influence of Christianity in the 4th century in his own peculiar way. He has implemented a strategy which contains at least 3 strands: the selection of a distinguished group of very special pagan intellectuals, the highly selective emphasis on their divine nature, and the use of Homeric allusions to reinforce these 2 components by adding Homer's authority as the perfect pagan poet. This attempt to counter the rise of Christian influence and power in the late 4th century may seem like a rearguard battle he cannot win, but for a fair assessment, I advocated that we distinguish between bookish embellishment and zealous allusion, between literary flourish and pious maneuvering. I suggest that the outcomes of my argument amounts to 3 points, which contribute to the reception of Homer, to the verdict on Eunapius's literary ambitions, and the question of its genre. So first, because the presence of Homer has not gone unnoticed, I've made a concerted effort to show that my interpretation of Homer in Eunapius should be based in all the echoes, allusions, and quotations. As soon as we paid attention to single words, quotations, phrases, and truncated quotations, the sum total of Homeric material not only expanded, but became highly suggestive of a deliberate usage beyond literary adornment. A second result arose, I think, from my presentation of passages that demonstrated how important it was to examine not only the occurrence of Homeric material, but the particular placement of such materials. The combination of these two aspects pointed to a subtle play on authority and polemic, both in favor of his heroes and against the Christians. In other words, Eunapius appeals to Homer as the paragon of pagan literature within a wider panegyric strategy. The divine nature of a subset of his chosen subjects was boosted by the Homeric references to gods and heroes. Eunapius reserves the superlative theotatos, most divine, most divinely inspired, for his own fabulous four: Porphyry, Plutarch, Iamblichus, and Poiresius. As a result, we found that Eunapius's initial claim in 1-2 to demonstrate their moral excellence by giving a brief account of their lives is achieved by a more narrowly focused program of highlighted those qualities of the four, and as it turned out also one woman, that makes them, in his own view, and that of those observing them, divine or like divine beings. After all, union with the divine was the Platonist goal in life, a striving that Plato had already articulated in his dialogue Theaetetus. And third and last, we should acknowledge that in these biographical sketches, Eunapius engages in a form of shadowboxing. He seems to construct a counter-narrative to Christian claims about the special nature of their rising stars, the saints, lauded in the burgeoning genre of saints' lives between 350 CE, when Athanasius wrote the life of Anthony, the first and much emulated saint's life, and 400 CE, where Eunapius wrote his lives. Significantly, one of Eunapius's contemporaries, Jerome, also wrote his outstanding men in the 390s CE. Moreover, Homer's presence in the 4th century texts can be explained more coherently by viewing the explicit and implicit allusions as a cumulative dossier meant to prop up a more ambitious agenda. His literary ambition, such as it was. Eunapius's stated agenda focused on the significant deeds of virtuous men, and in this pursuit, he has no doubt inspired by the efforts of Emperor Julian in the early 360s to reinstate pagan ways and the worship of traditional gods. In short, an anti-Christian narrative fits Eunapius's well-known hostility towards the Christians, and his fervor emerges most clearly in his polemical outbursts and allows us to say that he cannot be read as straight documentary history. It fits the characterization by the Temmermann and others of ancient biographical works, namely that they have a complicated relation with the truth and exhibit a tendency to what they call fictionality, giving the genre a bad press. Even today's scholarly discourse on biographies as a genre seems to acknowledge this. In the words of the world's foremost expert of the genre, Nigel Hamilton, biography, that is to say, our creative and non-fictional output devoted to recording and interpreting real lives, has enjoyed an extraordinary renaissance in recent years. But it is now one of the embattled front lines in the struggle between society's notions of truth and imagination. Based on these three insights, we can articulate an implication for the way in which we should adjust our assessment of the text's historical value. I suggest that Eunapius created a work which exhibits the historian's reflexes as well as an epigone's admiration, producing an awkward combination of fact and fiction that has misled some modern historians. While Eunapius may well have been influenced by earlier writings as a model, such as Philosophers' Lives of Sophists, which he actually mentions, the particular agenda he had in mind is, I submit, his own, namely, to show that the great holy men of the Hellenic tradition could stand as exemplars for moral betterment backed by Homeric authority, in order to match or outdo the new holy men of Christianity. Thank you for your patience.